Nice to meet you, everyone. My name is James Hammond. I've been working in IT and operations sides of the business, different businesses and third sector organizations for almost 17 years now. So it's quite impressive, actually. So 17 years, been around. The one key thing that I've found has been the absolute system that you need to make sure you have is to understand where everything is. But when you're starting out, you need to create a baseline. And that's where we're going to be starting off the conversation today. When you're creating a baseline of objects, we need to be able to start with somewhere that allows you to have everything contained within one system of record. And in that case, the CMDB, the configuration management database, is the absolute key. But first thing I wanted to throw up here was a quote from Tony Robbins. I love this particular one purely because I do it and I'm quite retentive like that. I'm obsessive. I try and set a baseline for everything I do. So if you don't set a baseline standard for what you'll accept in life, you'll find it easy to slip into behaviors and attitudes or a quality of life that's far below what you deserve. And I think that particular thing rings true for a lot of different areas within IT. If we don't have our standards, if we don't have our behaviors, our mantras, our katas, our processes and way of working, the quality of what's going to be delivered out to our organizations, our customers, is going to be far below what both they and us actually deserve to have. So I'm probably going to be preaching to the choir with this particular slide, but I need to try and get this out as the idea of where we're going to be keeping these pieces of information, because if we don't have, like I said, I'll repeat it again, the baseline for devices is the key to understanding where all of these bits come forward. If you don't have your baseline of knowing what you've actually got in the first place, if you try and implement further technologies such as the AIOps that we've spoken about, you're just not going to get anywhere with them, purely because you won't know what you had in the first place. How do you know what you've got now is correct? So our CMDB is recognized within IT service management frameworks as a cornerstone structure. We use it to ensure that items required to deliver services have proper controls around them. We have accurate and reliable information about those configuration items and that they're available when and where they're needed. But then we also have the ability to identify, control, record, report, audit, and verify. And it's that audit and verify that's always useful with these particular bits and pieces to go forward. CMDB will always be the key. It's used by almost all IT service management frameworks, and it's essentially the idea of having that one system of record. So what you'll find in here is, as I'm going to go through the CMDB, there's one key area of IT where we can find certain types of devices, which are IT devices, and we can find what's called OT devices, which are operational technology. And that's a key part, is understanding the difference between the two and how we can find these devices across the network. So the key part here is understanding the main difference between these types of devices. We have IT devices on one side, which are the sorts of things we normally expect to find within our networks that as IT people we're used to dealing with, and they tend to be multifunctional devices that we interact with regularly. So all the people's personal devices in your organization, your printers, your servers, you could have your containers, the underlying infrastructure that you run it on, whether that be a cloud service or something like that, but they all tend to be multifunctional. Whereas depending on the type of organization you have, there is a second side, which is referred to as OT, or operational technology devices, which tend to be smaller, single function, limited interaction devices. So these are the types of things that if you're making something, if you're manufacturing something, or even if you're doing low level monitoring of certain networks. So Oceanography institutes use OT devices to measure pressure waves, or you have utilities that are able to look at the content of gas pipes or water networks throughout the system. So process logic controllers and CNC machines, industrial actuators, these are all devices that have relatively limited or single functions that allow you to go in and do one thing, whether that's checking a temperature or pressure. Often you'll find devices will have the ability to do volume, pressure, and temperature all in one device, but that's all they can do, is then broadcast that signal. What we found across all of these is you've got one baseline that makes them all work, and that is your networking. Using the network that connects these devices up is your best way of getting the information into the CMDB. So you've got three main methods of looking for OT devices, and these interact with IT devices, but you will often find that when you're dealing with limited function devices on a network, you'll often only you'll only be able to find them in certain areas within the system. Okay, so we have what's called active network scanning tools. And this is the idea of a system that essentially goes out across the whole network that you run within your company and says, right, what devices are active? What are you? And can I log into you? Where are you from? What do you do? And when you're dealing with these types of network scans, they can be political because nobody really wants everyone taking up network traffic, banging on doors. You know, oh, hi, how are you? Type thing. What do you do here? It can cause all kinds of basic political things where people just don't want to be constantly dealing with it, but they're also quite useful in other respects. So being able to interact with the devices, especially when you're dealing with things like servers and personal devices and the types of high functioning IT devices, active network scanning works really well. But when you're dealing with OT devices will not always allow you to interact with them, especially if you're dealing with devices in a highly sensitive environment, like a utility such as a water plant or a electrical substation. These things are all security cordoned off, and that's where the next level of being able to come in is passive scanning. So the idea with passive network scanning is, instead of trying to interact with every single device on the network and saying, hi, how are you? We do it the other way around. We say, right, which devices are actually pushing information across the network? And the thing with these types of OT devices, especially because they're constantly pushing information, they say, hi, I'm here, this is my serial number, and these are my readings from the last 2 minutes. And they'll be broadcasting out to a particular address. Picking up and monitoring those packets of network traffic allows you to actually see, oh, I have this OT device, I'm a process logic controller that's got a temperature sensor on it. And, oh, this temperature sensor is talking to this particular device. So not only do we have an idea of what that device is, we know what type of information it's covering, we also know where it's going to. So it allows us to then look to interact with those devices a lot better and actually, pull some information and relationships between these devices. The only issue with passive network monitoring is you require a lot more time to collect data. If you're doing an active scan, you've literally got one session with a device, knock on the door. Hi, what's your name? What's your number? What you do? Great, it's off. But when you can't interact with the device, you may have to look at the OT devices over a period of time. So you may find that the same PLC that I used as an example earlier will only be talking on the network for once every 5 minutes or once every day. In fact, it may only be sending things once a day when the fire alarm system at a particular office that's being monitored gets turned on, because we've got extra functionality overnight. So you, by only scanning these things over time, will actually be able to determine more relationships. So essentially you have to make do with one of those two methods, but there is a third one, especially when you're dealing with Scada based stuff. So this particular one, when you're dealing with OT stuff, is basically what's known, the system that's used to run large nuclear plants. So anything that has a large number of OT limited function devices will have a single SCADA system controlling them. And the idea is that these systems will all report into the SCADA as the one point of contact. Now, these things have been around for at least 35, 40 years. In fact, they developed out of the original power generation plants that first started way back when. And these ones are actually designed to sit there and collect this information. And what they tend to do is they put it into a system called a historian, which is literally a massive database of all the information previously pulled up by the device over time, and gives you a treasure trove of information to say, hi, all the devices that are currently interacting, where they come in, what they're doing. That essentially gives you, between those three methods, the ability to say, here's all the devices that we're using across the plant to make things work. So now we come to the next major bit, the ability to integrate data from multiple sources into CMDB. When you're dealing with this type of information, especially if you're dealing with one project I'm currently on, I have at least 7 different plants that I'm looking to pull information in from. And these 7 different plants all have multiple sources of data and have at least 3,000 to 5,000 devices in them at a time. Now, obviously, I'm not going to sit there and go around with a clipboard checkboxing, especially in the current environment, but also it would take me forever to do so. So the best way of pushing this information into the CMDB is digital integrations. All of the systems that we've dealt with previously will have control level devices at the top. So you don't have all the PLCs reporting into one area, they will all report into one single device. And it's that device that we want to get information from into the CMDB, because not only can it allow us to pull in our baseline, it can then be used later on to keep that information in a good state. So these are kind of the 5 main behaviors, best practices that I try and force when I'm doing integrations with people. First off, bog standard, setting your roles and responsibilities. We need to make sure that every person in the team that we're dealing with, because sometimes integrations are normally built by one person, but they normally interact with at least 3 or 4 as a main system. Plus you've got people within the customer who are internal experts on what they do. So you need to make sure that everyone understands where they sit within the system and who's responsible for what level of that integration you've got. The analytics is your key part. Looking at the types of data that you've actually got coming in, how often it's being updated, how complete it is, what type of information you have within that integration, what's actually going to be useful in the CMDB. I don't need to know the current temperature that's within that's being reported by a particular PLC unit, but I do need to know its make, model, and manufacturer, for example, because then I can then use that information to do processes elsewhere for IT asset management. Okay, so understanding what you've got in there, and that defines the type of integration that you can put into place. Collaboration. these types of integrations, they are not an autonomous overnight result ever. That's clear. You need to spend a lot of time working with the people who actually do that data, analyzing it over a period of time and making sure that you've actually got the right systems in place. If you don't have that collaboration, you essentially get siloed information, which can be the absolute death of most practices going forward. Fitting the future into place, you need to be able to, in each integration strategy, you need to understand, okay, I've got a system in place. It may have been in place for 10 years already. We're looking to move that from 10 people here, 10 years to being refitted in the next 2. Should we be doing integration at this level? Should we be looking at integrating with a system that's coming in 2 years' time? Or should we be looking to try and build something that fits in with both? So essentially using that to understand what the roadmaps are, these different products, and how you expect that business to evolve over time will allow you to define how you build that structure out. And the last one is an absolute key one, is defining your stakeholders at all stages. I may have the case of, having your internal expert about one particular data source in the idea of figuring out how the integration works in the first place and the types of information you want to pull in. Once you move into a stage of, in use, constant usage of that particular integration, do you actually need to keep that person in place? Do they need to stay with that particular one? So being able to define those stakeholders at all stages of your development is a crucial part of your integration. Quality control. Absolutely love this idea of quality control. The CMDB, as I've mentioned previously, is the key part of any particular area that you deal with. If you allow dodgy data, and I'm going to use the word dodgy because that's probably the best way of describing it, into your CMDB, you will cause yourself problems, not just in your area, but almost every area of the business that interacts with that database. So you've got to absolutely make sure that as part of your building of that integration, you've got a defined, validated source, and it must be automated wherever possible. I realize that's not always the case in certain scenarios, but automation first would be the key part of getting that data in. And also segregation of data. Always having a staging area in place that allows you to put controls around that data is a key part. I'm currently working on one particular integration where I'm getting 47 fields across 3 tables to come in, but the actual information that goes into the CMDB comprises 15 of those fields. So having a staging area allows me to see how that data comes in from that integration over time, and allows me to sit there and update that data. So in some cases, I may be adding more information in. So for example, I may be pulling location information from another table to add it into the CMDB record for that particular device. Or I may be pulling information around the asset because I understand that as part of that integration, a particular device is only giving me a subset of asset information that I may actually need. So that's a key part there, is understanding those 2 main areas of quality control combined with the 5 previous points I said about integrations. Then allows you to push into this idea of an automated data push. So you can essentially then, once you've created your baseline, create this idea of a constantly updating, refreshed data set that is working on a standard system. So we have this idea of pushing data into the staging area, having those validated controls, look at the data that's coming in, make sure it's what we expect, how it works. And then once you've got that data being pushed there, having those changes being pushed from the staging area into the CMDB automatically will then allow you to take further information from your staging area. So having that information baselined out, pushed into one area, formatting it, reviewing it, validating it against what you've already got, and then pushing it into your CMDB allows you to build out that information over time to be able to keep a living system based on that baseline. So this is the part where you think about where the CMDB hits in with all these other areas, including both IT service and IT operations management. So once you've got the devices sitting in your baseline of your CMDB, they're all sitting there nicely. You have literally every single process that you can think of that fits in with all of these different areas of IT can then be taken advantage of to make further operations in. So event management and monitoring for IT operations management can then lead into further information around the IT asset management process for hardware lifecycle and procurement. You know, being able to see whether or not a PLC unit is constantly failing from event management and monitoring, but then allow you to see where it is within the hardware lifecycle status, and potentially look at purchasing newer assets or whether or not those assets should fit in with their standard system of purchasing new stuff in. But then also interacting with the IT service management, and this is the kind of key, because all of these things fit in and work over networking. Having the idea of these devices in the CMDB allows you to take advantage of basic change management. You know, being able to say, oh, we're changing something with those bits. Let's find out all of the stuff that we're going to be affected. Oh, here's actually a bunch of stuff we're going to take out on a production floor because, you know, we're updating a switch. We've got to cycle the switch, and all of these things may absolutely fall over because they're not getting the information they need from the switch. So we could lose a whole production line. Being able to capture those types of things in the first place will then allow you to interact with the other AIOps areas, moving through to things like incident and problem management as well. So what I'm trying to put across all of these bits is having the CMDB as the baseline for everything, where we're pushing all of the relevant data about what we've physically got in our network into this one database so that every other system can see that one database is kind of the key. And I just want to finish on one quote. It's from a former boss of mine, and I have to admit that I pretty much live this mantra going forward is, if it's not in the CMDB, it doesn't exist. And from that, I will now pass the baton back to my colleague, Daniel.